Tangako Gilwap Sundal Nabamak, Kolasi Kolpa at the Gakim Sotiag, Ablasam was not this Liwiuk open, Kenok Imeldan Liwiuk. Welcome to our lesson for today. I welcome you to this. What we're going to share today is the background, what we call a timeline. And a timeline is pre-contact to present day, what happened to the language. Because a lot of times people are asking, what happened to the language? You know, how come, what happened to it politically? What happened to it socially? What happened to it culturally? What happened to it spiritually? Because we talked about that before. So today I'm just kind of going to give you a timeline that we use in our work as a way of knowing what happened to the language. So the first thing that we realize is there was an age of independence. And in the age of independence is pre-contact. And the next age, which, you know, I'm going to go to each of these individually, but just wanted to give you an overview here. Age of reciprocity is initial contact, where we started to greet each other, and there was no language lost there. Age of destruction, pre-confederation. Before there was an Indian Act. Okay? And so what started to happen in the colonial, colonized worldview. Then, of course, we go into the age of destruction post-confederation. And then we go on to age of healing and reciprocity, or age of healing. So that's what we're going to discuss. So age of independence. What was really key at that time, we were a unilingual society, meaning there was one language spoken in our society. Not like today. Today you'll hear some Spanish in our Maliseet communities, some French in our Maliseet communities, some English in our communities, and a few Maliseet speakers. In my youth, I only heard 2 languages in my home. They were actually French and Maliseet. It's not until I went to school that I heard the 3rd language, which was English, because my grandfather was from a French Maliseet community in Quebec. So in the age of independence, we had a unilingual society. Maliseet was the primary language. That's what you greeted people with, that's what you thought in, that's what you socialized in. All ceremonies were done in our language. Language was thriving. It was because you heard it, you know, and when they talk about oral tradition, this really shows the oracy of it, because that's all you heard, you know, so it was very comforting. And not that long ago, somebody had asked me what my favorite childhood memory was, and I have to admit, it was listening to the elders speaking the language around the kitchen table next to the wood stove, and the laughter and the questions and the responses. It was just a very close-knit community, and I miss that because that close-knittedness isn't present anymore because we're all online instead. We don't visit each other. I remember an elder saying that computers are wonderful, but computers can't hug the child when the child pronounces it right. So, so today we're missing that humanness, the vibrations of our language. Oral tradition, very, very strong, and oracy was something that we have to protect today. I know I have a logo on my drum where it talks about as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, you know, and the grass grows, we carry our language. I want this to be really true. In that scenario today, I've added a tree. I want us speakers to be that tree, to remain rooted to the language we were brought up in, to be able to pass it on to future generations. So we need a tree added to that scenario of as long as the sun shines, the grass grows and the rivers flow. We now need that strength of that tree. So Skijinawausawagan was present, meaning our culture was intact. There was no questions about it. And today there's an absence of that, and I call it the absence of sacredness, because just this past weekend I was smudging some youth, and one youth had never seen a smudge before, and that surprises me. So this is what happens when that flow of language was interrupted. So Age of Independence, there was no questions at all. Everything was celebrated. In the age of reciprocity, meaning there was interaction from one language to another. And there's a term that's called additive bilingualism, which means there was no law saying you can only use one language over the other. That didn't happen at the beginning, not during the age of reciprocity. We accepted French, and French accepted Maliseet. We had people that were speaking both languages, and they were learning from each other. So there was a good move between one language over the other. So that's called additive bilingualism, and that was during the age of reciprocity, when nobody was trying to take anybody's language away. In the age of destruction, pre-Confederation, you start to see what we call subtractive bilingualism. That's when, the colonizers were starting to take language away and saying, we have to adopt English-only policies. Like for the school that I went to, no Maliseet was allowed in the school. That was in my day school. As soon as we left our home, we had to somehow convert to English, even when we were playing. And so the nuns were out there, overseeing this process of assimilation. So that's what we call subtractive bilingualism, because you're taking one language away and replacing it with another. That was the beginning of that destruction. That subtractive bilingualism eventually leads to a process called assimilation, where not only did we couldn't use our traditional names. As I introduced myself, Oblossom was the name that I was born with. But when I went to school, I wasn't allowed to use Oblossom was. I had to take on an English name. So a lot of that assimilation policies were, in place at our community school in the community of Tobic, where I went to school. We weren't allowed to wear our traditional regalia. If we wanted to take moccasins to school, they weren't allowed. There were other styles that we had to wear. So it not just affected the language, it affected our culture, it affected our worldview, it affected how we perceived ourselves, because then we thought there was something wrong with us because we were constantly being corrected for an action, a word, or a deed. And so that process was very destructive. And so in the beginning, Maliseet, and I have, you'll see it on the slide, I have a graph, and you'll see at pre-contact in the red how strong Maliseet was, and there was just a little bit of English. And pre-Confederation, you could start seeing Maliseet descend a little bit, and you see the other languages ascending. And of course, post-Confederation, totally reversed, where there's more English and French and less Maliseet language. And so it affected the whole community. In the age of destruction, pre-Confederation, subtractive bilingualism began the spiral down, I think, of our language use, because we weren't allowed to speak our language. Their English-only policies were promoted both by the government but also the churches, so they kind of partnered. into bringing those teachers that their main duty was to make sure that we learned English. And assimilation processes occur when not just the language changes, but the whole worldview and the whole way of thinking and doing things also changes. For example, our diets changed. You know, it's become a big issue today because when we talk about food security, you know, it's so important because I was brought up in a time when we didn't need grocery stores. We ate everything off the land. And, you know, so we didn't have additives and, you know, preservatives and all of that are so unhealthy for us today. We didn't hear about cholesterol issues because moose was our main staple. And today we worry about the beef, the chicken, and all of the imported fruits and vegetables that are coming from so far away that don't grow on our territory. So as our food changes, our diet changes, our use of the land changes, where we don't, you know, I remember a time when every single person in our community had a garden. And the women would say, well, I'll plant more green beans this year, and you plant more onions and radishes and carrots, and everybody was able to exchange it. And I remember the women coming to my grandmother's, and everybody would be bringing baskets, and everybody had something, you know. So when we stopped doing that, there were some people who had it and some people who didn't, and that wasn't. We didn't have people who didn't have anything at that time. So that assimilation was more than just affecting the language. It also affected the way that we perceived ourselves, the way that we lived. Clothing changed. Transportation. You know, think about the birch bark canoe, how it didn't pollute the river, and you know, and that's how we traveled. Along came the motors that started to alter. You know, and then there was this. I remember as a child seeing the logging and all the logs, the pulp mills that were sending logs down the river, and how it changed the river after the logs passed by. So our territory changed. So assimilation is very destructive to the language, to the culture, to the worldview, and the belief system. So you could imagine. I remember a priest asking one of our elders, Charles Salmon, how did you go to confession before the priests came? And of course, he says, we had a way of doing that. We went to a birch bark tree, and we would ask the tree to take our burdens, because we're not supposed to carry burdens on our shoulders. And so you would just open up the bark and hang on to the tree and ask the tree to take your burdens, and then close the bark back up and walk away knowing you didn't have your burdens anymore. And the elders say that today when you see the marks on the birch, it was all the burdens that the trees have taken for our people. And we still use that. We still do that today. We teach our young people when they can't talk to another two-legged or a human, that they could go to the tree, they can go to the river, they can go to the stones and ask the stones to carry their burdens. So that's the way, so it altered how we prayed as well. So then the church comes, and there's a story that I like when a priest was trying to convince the elder who was praying near a tree to come into the church and pray. And of course the priest says, why are you praying out here? Why don't you come inside and pray in the church? And of course the elder says, well, Father, I've already been to the church, because that's the tree that I used to pray to, that's now your church. So I've already been to church. So see what happens about that religious worldview. And of course, if you didn't go to church, you were considered a sinner. And there's words that have been incorporated into our language that have nothing to do with our worldview, like the word hell. We have a word for hell, but it doesn't mean the same as it does in English. And for us, when we use the word want, which is devil, it actually has to do with an emotion, a negative emotion that causes you to react in a negative way, but you don't necessarily have the horns and the pitchfork and all of that. So it's a whole different way of thinking of that word. Today, young people that are learning the language, they're going to look at the word want and they're not going to see it as an action, or they're going to see it as somebody with the horns and the tail and all that. So it matters how we think in our language and when we don't think in our language. So it's affected. So you could see how the language was demoted, and possibly by our own people, because there were people who were rewarded for using more English than Maliseet, because the Indian agent had that power to say, if I hear only English in your home, I'll give you extra blankets, I'll give you extra supplies. But if I hear Maliseet in there, then I'm going to deny you those. So there was a lot of those stories that have been collected through the years of how language was used as a bargaining tool, that if you spoke more English, you'd be rewarded more, but if you spoke Maliseet, then you would be punished. In my own home, people always say, why are there so many dogs in First Nation communities? And I remember we always had a dog that would be outside, and when the dog barked, we knew it was possibly the priest or the nun coming up the sidewalk, and my grandmother would switch to English because the dog would be warning us that a stranger was coming to the home. So we'd be speaking Maliseet, but as soon as we hear the dog bark, we'd switch to English, and yes, it would be a priest checking up on us because he had that right to come whenever he wanted to. So we protected our language, and I really appreciate my grandmother still insisting that Maliseet was our language, that English didn't belong to us. We were just borrowing it. So that's the age of destruction. So you could see how language was affected in that way. Now, in the next stage of destruction, post-Confederation, and post-Confederation means things are more legal now. They've established their government. The first thing that they come up with was an Indian Act. And within that Indian Act are these guidelines about the responsibility of the Department of Indian Affairs in taking care of the Indians. And of course, just the word Indian is a word that we don't use to call ourselves. So see what happens in assimilation processes is your identity is actually taken from you. You're no longer Wolastoq. You're no longer Skijin. You are an Indian. So today we're trying to remove the word Indian from our own people, but they've been brought up and being called Indians. That this word Indian Act, Department of Indian Affairs. So I think unfortunately, the word Indian is going to stay, at least in my lifetime. Hopefully, in my hopefully it'll change, because we're not Indians. We're Wolastoq, people of the river. After the Indian Act, that's when they said, well, in order for us to take care of the Indians, we'll have to set up schools. We'll have to teach them how to be more civilized in their word, meaning how do they assimilate us? How do they get us from praying to the tree and the river and bringing us into those churches? How do they teach us how to read in English but not in our languages? So there was a movement of actually removing children from the families to be taught in that. So residential schools was part of the other punishment, and every survivor will tell you the one thing that they missed the most when they were in those schools is their language, because it was comforting to them, but they weren't allowed that little bit of comfort by using their languages in the schools. So that affected the language. So you could see what was happening. There was this tidal wave coming, attacking, the language. Indian day schools. Now, I know there's a lot of survivors that will say residential schools were bad, but You'll still have some people that say Indian day schools were just as bad. Yes, they weren't taken away from their families or their community, but it was pretty bad in those schools as well. We saw punishment. We saw abuse. Both, I saw physical abuse myself. And I was, I couldn't believe that a nun who was a representative of the church would carry next to her rosary a big wide horsewhip, to use at her discretion whenever she felt somebody wasn't obeying or somebody was using her language. So language was forbidden. And what does that do to a person when you're told you can't use your language anymore? You can't think in your language anymore. So it affects you. It affects you culturally. Those ceremonies that we brought up with were no longer allowed. It affected us socially. For example, when children were born, the parents themselves didn't have a choice of what to name their children. The nuns would actually come with the Bible, and they would go through and open it up. Well, we already have this name, we already have that. Let's name this one this, and that's why in my generation, every single one of us women, we all carry the name Mary as a first name or a middle name. So, and all the boys had Joseph. So you could see the Catholic realm in that. So it affected us socially. Economically, it affected us as well, because all those things that our people did to live off the land all became departments of something. Departments of fisheries, no longer fishing in your own territory, where the province has developed the Department of Fisheries, and now you have to have a license to fish. And elders were very adamant in saying, if you're going to put us on reservations, are you going to ask the salmon, they can't go beyond this line? Are you going to ask the deer? Are you going to ask the moose that they can't leave the territory, because that's how we're going to survive? So it affected us economically. So men had to find a different way of providing for their families, and which meant they had to earn money one way or the other. And I do have a wonderful story of an elder, Elder Raymond Nicholas, who shared with me that there was a time his father was working in the woods, and when he came from the woods, the Indian agent went up to him and gave him, I think, $2. And of course the elder said, "What's this for?" And he goes, "It's yours." And the elder goes, "Did I earn it?" The Indian agent says, "No, you don't have to. Everybody's going to get free money." And of course, the elder declined and said, "I didn't earn it, I don't want it." And he never accepted it. So that kind of pride it is something to brag about, because that's the way that our people were. They didn't want handouts. They wanted to earn it. They knew their responsibility. There was a work ethic that was so beautiful that needs to be revived again. And hopefully in this stage of today, we want that work ethic to come back. So economically, it was difficult for those men who were living off the land, that weren't allowed to fish, weren't allowed to cut the lumber or cut the wood, because the Indian agent had control of who could cut and for what and for when and for how long. So we lost all those controls, so that became the Department of Forestry. So the province now has a forestry department, and which originally was, First Nations. So the language was affected economically, and of course politically. We have a system that's in place today that doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the Indian Act process, where a chief is elected every 2 years, And so the guidelines aren't, okay, you can do as you wish. There's actually provincial and federal guidelines that the chief has to abide by. So it's not our system. So the Indian Act under the Department of Indian Affairs is very instrumental in this language shift and language loss. So the day schools were not supportive in saving language. Age of healing and revival, which I believe we're in today. You know, there's a resurgence of wanting to know your identity. We've started to use the word Wolastoq again to name the river, because I tell people St. John is the middle name of Wolastoq, you know, but Wolastoq is the first name, and St. John is the second name, because it was already Wolastoq. Language nests are, language nest is a process where you get speakers and non-speakers that'll come together and they'll teach each other language, and that's what's happening today. So there's a lot of these language nests. There's language nest where grandmothers will actually go and help the newborns to hear the language, where they sing to them, the lullabies. There's a lot of things that are being revived and coming back, the old songs. There's new songs being made, but there's also old songs that are being revived and kept. Lots of language programs. There's immersion models in some of the communities. There's, there's still a lot of work to be done. I'd like to see immersion within the community, not just in the school, because when it's in the school, it helps, but it's only, it then gets treated like a subject. It doesn't get treated like a medicine pouch to carry for the rest of your life, which is what language is. It's your medicine. It's your bundle. It's so sacred, you have to carry it. So that's what we need to promote, is thinking of language in that way. So we need to put into our language programs more of a survival skill to make sure that it's going to be saved. Literacy. There's a lot of controversy about literacy, because some elders, in my career as a linguist, my first few years as a linguist, I had elders that were upset of my career choice because they believed that language shouldn't be written. And I remember being so disappointed, because I thought, yes, I'm going to save the language, I'm going to write it, I'm going to leave behind, all these writings, etc. And when I had some elders say, our language shouldn't be written, it should be oral, it bothered me to the point that I had to do something spiritual, and that's when I went on a fast. And it was probably a blessing in disguise, because in my fast I realized what a gift we have as peoples. We get to travel between the spirit world and the physical world in a ceremony called Vision Quest, and that's where all my answers came. Of course, write your language. We had petroglyphs, we had wampum belts, we have a system that we can be proud of. We can see the words because we're starting to not hear it as often, so we need another sense to be able to keep the language alive. If the oral tradition is totally gone, then at least we have the written version that we can still see the language and still feel the medicine from that bundle. So literacy is very key. Some people may say you don't need a writing system. I disagree, because you need to write it, and you know how you feel when you misspell something in English. It bothers you. I want that same respect for our language. So for me, it's worth it to learn how to read it and write it. It's worth it to know that we have a system. We have a system that was designed, and not by non-natives, as people seem to think, because sometimes you'll hear people call writing systems, it belongs to this linguist or it belongs to that linguist. Well, those linguists couldn't have put the language together without speakers, so there was a collaboration there. And that's what's really important, is those linguists, the ones that came to my grandmother, they didn't say, Malihan, could you give me an example of a animate word and an inanimate word? My grandmother wouldn't have known what the linguist was talking about. Or a transitive verb and an intransitive verb. My grandmother would have sent him out the door after his tea. But he said, tell me a story, Malihan. And my grandmother would tell a story in the language, then the linguist then takes it, and then they do their mechanical genius, and then they separate what's plural, what's tense, what's singular, what's plural, on all of that. So the language doesn't belong to a linguist, it belongs to our people because it's their language. And all the linguist did was put it in, help collaborate to put it into a system, what's called orthography. So I do use the Maliseet Passamaquoddy orthography that's been worked on for over 30 years by beautiful elder David Francis, and worked on by other, Marjorie Purley from Tobique helped on that. There's a lot of people that helped put that link together, and so of course Robert Levitt also helped in that, and so there was a collaboration. So it doesn't belong to Robert Levitt, and I know he won't mind me saying this, but it belongs to the people. There was a collaboration, and that's, you think about sweetgrass braid. When you see a sweetgrass braid and it's unbraided, you see it loose. There's no form. And that's probably what would have happened if we would have kept it oral. And if we lost our speakers, how are we going to save it? But the braiding of linguists and the people coming together to make sure that the language survives is the strength of it. So today we have written documents. We have children who are learning how to read in the language. So I'm quite proud of the literacy model of our language. Immersion models, as I said, immersion shouldn't just be in the school, immersion should be in the entire community. So that's what's happening in the age of healing and revival. Along with, if you want to learn the language, some tips on how to learn the language if you don't already know it. To learn the language if you do not already know it. To seek to become fluent if we are marginal speakers. The ones that'll say Dungok, and then somebody will say, oh, Michidabesquin Gillom, and they'll go, that's all I know. So you need to expand on that. Be able to say how you feel, be able to greet somebody, be able to know how to speak to an elder, because there's ethical ways of speaking to either a child, a woman, a male, or an older person. So those are things you have to be aware of. Teach it to your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews in the home. That's the only way that it's make it oral again, if we're going to save it. To support the teaching of language in the school, volunteering to help all of the language teachers, whatever projects that they're working on. Ask how you can be of help, for the language teachers. To offer sessions outside of the school for anyone interested in learning language, especially in the summertime, because we don't want our children to think that language is just from September to June, for the younger grades, or September to the first term. We need to make sure that there's programs that are going to keep going throughout the entire year, so that there'll always be a place for anybody that wants to learn to go and learn their language. By pushing to set up language banks in our community, in our communities, this is a term from Verna Kirkness, a language warrior from British Columbia. She had wrote this book, Aboriginal Languages, in 1998, and she was saying we should set up language banks. And she said banks are where you collect stories and do recordings, and so record your elders, and those will be like your banks. By encouraging and supporting language immersion camps for both young and old, and that way you're learning the language naturally, as opposed to isolating words and trying to make sense of where is it going to fit in your life, how are you going to use it. So these are just some of the ways that you can learn to learn your language. I also tell people that what you learn, I want you to carry it, just like Verna's saying, carrying it to a bank, it's saving it. Trust me, the interest that it's going to, give you by learning a word a day, 2 words a day, and build up on it so that you can actually have your own bank of knowledge and words and something you can definitely leave behind. There was an elder from Kingsclear First Nation, beautiful elder Veronica Atwin, the late Veronica Atwin, and I just always admired what she did for her 10 children. She made them each a language book, which she actually did her own illustrations, and she left one for each of her children. Imagine getting a gift like that. That's the kind of thing that we have to think about. We have to move away from let the schools do the work, or let the children do the work by sending them off to school to learn their language. Everybody has to do the work. Everybody in the community, both Native and non-Native people that live in our communities, have a responsibility to build that language nation that it was before they moved there. Wuliwan, Nadigakims, Gachanagazikaj, Kwalipton Kladwewagnan, Nitepsim, Upchich.